all for joining us today, and we're very pleased to have you with us for this session. As this entire conference has made clear, it's a very special time for biomedical innovation. We've seen unprecedented speed in developing effective diagnostic tests and treatments and vaccines for SARS-CoV-2, leading to plans for managing future outbreaks potentially very differently than pandemics have ever been managed in the past, with a fast path to diagnostic tests and treatments and even vaccines that could be widely available within 100 days. And this kind of progress in biomedical innovation is happening in many other areas as well. We've seen remarkable progress in many areas of cancer care, leading to falling cancer mortality rates in recent years, with the potential for more effective cell therapies, building on CAR T and other recent and emerging technologies, more targeted pathway therapies based on combinations of treatments, not to mention the opportunity for much earlier diagnosis of multiple cancers based on blood samples and the ability to target these combinations of therapies much more effectively. We've seen gene therapies come to market, some already approved, maybe a little bit slower pace than some were expecting, but many more potentially coming to the market, having pivotal clinical trials underway now, affecting rare and ultra-rare diseases, but also more common health conditions like hemophilia A and sickle cell disease just within the next several years. And then a lot of progress in effective biologic therapies for neurodegenerative diseases, including Alzheimer's disease, more effective targeted therapies for cardiovascular disorders, diabetes, including drugs that can drive substantial weight loss and maybe even reverse diabetes progression, drugs for cardiometabolic syndrome, other conditions that account for a huge share of premature death and disability. So that all might seem like good news, but there are some further challenges here, and that's why we're here this afternoon. Beyond the challenges of conducting the innovation, conducting the clinical trials, getting the treatments to market, how do we make sure these treatments are used as effectively and equitably as possible? One problem that gets a lot of attention is price, especially for transformative therapies that are expected to have long-term benefits for patients, where the treatments are approved maybe before those long-term benefits can possibly be completely clear. And we have a continuing debate in the United States and around the world about how much we should pay for drugs, with questions about whether the prices are really worth it based on their comparative effectiveness versus other treatments. And this is compounded in treatments when the approval might come way ahead of those long-term benefits. So a lot of issues related to price and affordability and innovation. And another big problem that has been highlighted at this conference is that our current healthcare systems are not necessarily well designed for early intervention, for accurate risk assessment to identify which patients are most appropriate for treatment, and then for timely access to those treatments across different geographic areas, urban and rural, diverse patient populations, including some populations that have traditionally been underserved, both here in the United States and from a global perspective. So we now have, for example, substantial excess supplies of the diagnostic tests for SARS-CoV-2, excess supplies of oral and intravenous therapies, excess supplies of vaccines, but still very big challenges in access to treatments. And these are all treatments that are paid for by government, so it's not a problem of the cost of the therapies themselves. So we want to talk about those challenges today. We're going to start off with a panelist who could not be here in person, but very much cares about the issues we're discussing today, and that's Dr. Meena Seshamani, who's the director of the Center for Medicare at the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services in Washington, D.C. And if this is, I think, where I say roll tape or something like that. All right.
I feel like
Hi, I'm Meena Seshamani, Director for the Center for Medicare and Deputy Administrator at the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. It is an honor to lead the Medicare program during this pivotal time in our nation's health. Medicare covers 63 million Americans, people over age 65 and over, people with end-stage renal disease, and those with disabilities. We partner with more than 1 million clinicians across the country, 6,000 hospitals, and we pay 1 in 5 healthcare dollars in our country. And so with that market size and power, the Medicare program really serves as an innovative force in our healthcare system. Where the Medicare program goes, many in the private sector partner and follow. And that is an opportunity and a responsibility that I take very seriously. So as we look forward to all of the innovations that have occurred during the pandemic and that are continuing to occur, it is critical that we evaluate these innovations and make sure that they serve the goals that we have for the future of the Medicare program, namely advancing health equity, driving high-quality person-centered care, and promoting affordability and sustainability of the program. And we will view all of these innovations and encourage all of these innovations in that lens. So as some examples, when we think about advancing health equity, there is no doubt that innovations can really help to improve access to care. For example, people being able to see a healthcare provider from the comfort of their home rather than having to take 3 buses to a clinic, where we have at-home technologies like an at-home dialysis technology that we recently approved additional payment for, because we know that end-stage renal disease patients tend to be among our most vulnerable and may have difficulty, for example, with transportation to a dialysis facility, and may need some support with additional resources to make sure that they stay healthy, especially during the pandemic. We want to make sure that what we are doing together is furthering these goals around advancing equity and keeping in mind whether technologies improve disparities or whether they worsen them, and really taking a critical eye to facts like in a recent Health and Human Services report that we found that Black and rural people with Medicare were less likely to engage in telehealth in 2020 for their visits. We want to know why that is and make sure that all of us are working together to address issues of inequities and have technology be a key avenue for that. The second pillar I mentioned is around high quality person-centered care. There is no doubt that innovations can really bring care to where people are, can address their holistic care needs, oftentimes outside of one clinic visit or one hospitalization, or further enhance those treatments in those episodes. And we want to make sure that we are continuing to drive innovations that are part of our overall holistic care models, innovations that can really bridge social needs and health-related needs, and make sure, again, that we are addressing those gaps that we see with an eye towards our more vulnerable populations. And the third pillar I mentioned around sustainability. I challenge innovators to make sure that the innovations lead us to spend money in a smarter way in our program. Make the people who are in the Medicare program get and stay healthy so that they avoid that hospitalization down the road, so they can engage more fully in their lives, in their communities. And so where there are opportunities for innovations to either replace existing models of care, like a video visit or an office visit, but move beyond that to think about care across the sectors where care normally occurs, and to really engage in ways that we keep people healthy so that we are improving overall in our healthcare system. So that's just some ways that we are thinking about innovations, again, with an eye towards how we can make sure that we are providing access and we are co-creating with all of you the future of the Medicare program so that we continue to serve the 63 million people who depend on the program. Thank you.
All right, I want to thank Mina for joining us virtually. Our other panelists are live, and I think they're going to have some perspectives as well on, as Mina talked about, some of the policy issues, payments, regulations, support for innovations that may not be biomedical products themselves, but might help them be used more easily or readily. But also, I hope some, as Mina suggested, some challenges to the private sector, not just people in the biopharmaceutical industry, but everyone here today who's involved in our health reform efforts. So we have a great panel, and I'm going to ask you to look at the program for details on their outstanding and distinguished bios. We're going to start with a few opening comments on this very broad topic from each of them, and then hopefully get into a pretty good dialogue. And before too long, we'll be calling on you all as well. You can use the app, as you hopefully know by now, to submit a question. Do that at any time. I'll try to work as many of these in as possible. But I want to start by going to Marianne de Bakker, who is Executive Vice President of Strategy, Business Development, Licensing, and Open Innovation for Bayer Pharmaceuticals. Marianne, you've been a leader in the healthcare industry for more than a couple of decades with extensive experience across pharmaceutical, biotech, tech innovation, involved in a wide range of partnerships and bringing these innovations to patients worldwide. What do you see as some of the key transformative innovations that you're most focused on now that seem to have the most, that generate the most enthusiasm for improving lives for patients, but also some of the key challenges in making the access to those technologies equitable and broad?
Sure, and a real pleasure to be here today. Thank you, Mark. Yeah, so I mean, we've been talking about it a lot. Healthcare is probably one of the biggest challenges that we face as a society. But at the same time, you know, the level of innovation that we are currently seeing is just mind-blowing. I'm a molecular biologist and biotechnologist myself, and I've been working in this industry for a couple of decades. And I mean, really on a weekly basis, we see technologies that really blow our mind and that create a whole new level of opportunities, you know, to prevent diseases, to treat diseases. Just to give you a couple of examples, you know, a couple of years ago, 2 years ago or so, we looked at, okay, how can we address, you know, a lot of unmet need in a different way. And very quickly, that leads you to looking at cell and gene therapies. What cell and gene therapies allow you to do is, for example, in the case of Parkinson's disease, you know, a disease that affects more than 10 million people, there hasn't been any innovation in the space for 50 years or so. We're treating patients still the same for decades. You know, we now can think about regenerative medicine, because what goes wrong in Parkinson's disease is that your dopaminergic neurons are not active anymore. And so we can now take pluripotent stem cells and we can transform them into dopaminergic neurons. And we can actually intrathecally bring those neurons into your brain and then look at how that restores function. So we acquired a company called BlueRock, for example, that is doing that, and we have now dosed 8 patients with that, you know, totally transformative technology. That is one example that, you know, if it turns out to work, it will be obviously transformative for so many patients. And then immediately the question will come, you know, how do you make that affordable? Because that's a type of treatment that is totally different from what you typically see. You know, a lot of our treatments in the pharmaceutical industry are chronic. You know, payers are used to systems where you pay for treatments over time. But, you know, in the case of cell therapies and also gene therapies, and I'll give some examples later, you often have, you know, a one-time treatment, and you sort of have the full cost of that treatment at once. And obviously that creates a lot of, you know, topics for discussion as to how is society going to be able to pay for that, and how are innovators going to be able to extract a profit from these very, very high-risk programs that require a lot of upfront investment in manufacturing, etc., and that, again, are incredibly high risk to take on. In the gene therapy space, while there have been a couple of setbacks in the ecosystem over the past years, we have acquired a company called AskBio, and we have 7 programs, gene therapy programs. So for genetic diseases like Pompe disease, Huntington disease, but also complex pathway diseases such as heart failure or again Parkinson's disease, we can now aim to treat that with a gene therapy. And again, that would be the gene that is defect in the disease you can bring in through a vector, and it's typically a one-time treatment. And it's a one treatment and done type of value proposition. And again, the whole payer system is really not set up to look at those kind of treatments. There is an incredible advancement, as you have undoubtedly heard, in the CRISPR-Cas and broader gene editing and prime editing area. We have entered into a partnership with Mammoth Biosciences to access that technology. And again, that will allow you to treat diseases like your sickle cell disease, many others, in a way that we were not able to do before. The same with cell therapy in cancer. We can now take your immune cells, T cells, transform them, and place them back in patients so that your T cells are going to really specifically target your type of cancer, as was not possible before. But again, those are all transformative approaches that require totally different ways of thinking how, again, society is going to pay for it and how are we going to deliver it to patients and ensure access. Now, I'm sure we're going to talk about access a lot on this panel, but I just want to make a final statement. I mean, there's this incredibly new innovations that I was mentioning, really things that are at the forefront of where innovation is happening, and there's going to be access issues. But let's not forget, a lot of treatments that we have today, the COVID vaccines even, very general treatments for rheumatoid arthritis or all sorts of diseases that, are innovations of the past. We still have a lot of access problems. I mean, not all patients that need those therapies currently can access them. So it's not just about, the latest innovations and how we're going to make sure patients get access to those, but also how can we really improve access in general to all those incredible, products that are already available for patients.
Yeah, Marianne, thanks for those great opening comments. And picking up on your last point, I'd like to turn next to Jay Ayer, who's the CEO of the Access to Medicines Foundation. And Jay, you've been thinking about that problem and working on that problem for a while. Access to medicines, for those who aren't familiar with it, Google them. They have great reports on an ongoing basis, especially an annual report that I find very insightful, highlighting some of the gaps in equity, gaps involving access to pharmaceutical and biotechnology products, but not only the gaps, what are some of the solutions and steps that can be taken to address them? So it's a nice combination of pointing out the problems, but trying to work on the solutions as well. And you've just heard from Marianne and me, from that matter, in the opening comments about all of the promising opportunities today for biomedical innovation. But while we were trying to make progress on these issues, boy, it seems like there's still a lot of challenges. So what do you see, Jay, as some of the best opportunities to help bring these very special innovations much more widely and equitably available across the world?
Difficult question.
It is a difficult question, but that's what we're here for.
That's what we're here for. Well, thanks again for having me here. So I think what we must remember is that 80% of the world's population live in low and middle income countries. And when you think about the minority communities, the ethnically diverse communities that also live in the poverty line, under the poverty line in the United States or in Europe, or the Northern Hemisphere to that matter, that number goes up very quickly to close to 100, almost 90-something%. So it tells you that our innovations are useless unless we think about equitable access and broad access. What's the point of having any scientific breakthrough if it reaches nobody at the end of it? But we have made a lot of advances, as Marcus just pointed out. There has been significant advances in terms of the research and development pipeline, in terms of collaborative efforts that have been instrumental in bringing many different innovations to the table. I think Bayer, Marianne, what you didn't speak about is a program also that they are running to ensure that contraceptive care is brought to people all around the world, and they work with the UN family planning associations to improve access to care. I think what we need to do right now, the biggest opportunity is to invest differently, to design products differently, and to enable access. So investment. We work right now with over 150 investment firms. These are the large banks, pension funds around the world. They use our data to engage with the pharmaceutical industry, the largest companies in the world, and biotech companies, in order to invest differently so that there's a lot more of that long-term value and view. They engage with the industry and they use some of our metrics, especially when companies have a similar financial rating as which company is actually making a stronger social impact. And these investors have grown in their ability to transform the healthcare system. When I first started at the foundation, most of the investors would say, sure, you're talking about corporate social responsibility activities in the rest of the world. That's pretty much it, maybe a couple of patient assistance programs. Today, 150, almost 200 of these investors, they invest in the pharmaceutical industry, in the quarterly financial calls and annual calls. They ask CEOs directly about what are you doing on access? What is your vision for ensuring that product reaches more patients? Today, even when you think about the United States and Europe, some of the products that have been recently launched in the last 5 to 10 years reach only about 10% of treatment-eligible patients in the United States or in Europe, and less than 1% in low-income countries. So to transform that, we need to make sure that we're looking at the largest gaps in the world and putting research and development efforts and investment into that space. We need to make sure we don't wait until US and Europe approvals before products are registered, or supply chains are considered, or partnerships are built in low-income countries. And a couple of companies are doing that. So today we've seen that about 8 out of the 20 largest companies have a system in place where every innovative product goes through a check by commercial and scientific teams to find out which countries can they be made available in. When I started at the foundation, there was not a single company prioritizing this. All of them would say, my products are not intended for the rest of the world. My products are intended for a small population. And I think that is the case today with certain innovations. But if you're working on sickle cell anemia, for example, and if it predominantly affects African American populations and people of African descent and living in Africa, you need to think about access differently. I think a second component of it is also in supply chains. Now, we've seen in the COVID pandemic that a lot of supply chains have been heavily disrupted. Many of the products that we've been taking, including COVID vaccines, are not necessarily a product that was designed and created by a single company, but it's a gathering of many different raw materials from all over the world. And a lot of geopolitics play an important role in blocking that access. So it's extremely daunting for innovators. But I think realizing that means having very close partnerships, making sure that politicians, governments, NGOs, companies understand that they need to partner up to reduce the costs and to enable access is an important component of it, and to fix the supply chain also downstream. And we're starting to see some improvement there. We see now many companies trying to qualify more suppliers so that there's not so much dependence on 1 or 2 countries, geographies, or companies when it comes to raw materials. More companies are now getting involved in manufacturing capacity so that there's at least better local availability in different geographic regions around the world, so that border closures don't prevent that. But I do think that one of the things that we need to think about is many people in the room today and in the conference, you sit on boards of the pharmaceutical industry, you sit on boards of universities, you sit on boards of investment firms. I think the question is, what are the innovations, are design principles of how products that are made available, are they actually reaching the poor, is a question that we have to ask. And by asking that, you actually tend to get results. Sometimes your question leads to people who may be somewhere in a corporate social responsibility arm of a company, and they get their first meeting with the CEO's team to talk about access and what work they've been doing. And it inspires often a CEO to say, okay, actually there's some significant work there. Can we not build a whole business proposition around this in place? Lastly, I want to talk about biotech companies, because I think we have a number in the room. I think we have seen in the last few years that there's a much more concentration of the large players. When it comes to vaccine development, there's a concentrated group of companies. When it comes to antibiotic development, there's also a concentrated group of companies that are involved in novel antibiotic development itself, because many companies are leaving areas where there's market failures. So more and more we're looking at the biotech companies for innovation, But biotech companies are not necessarily equipped for enabling broad access and scale. So the way we invest in biotech companies, the way biotech companies work with the global infrastructure and navigate the global infrastructure to enable access needs a better rethink. And there's a huge opportunity there to improve access.
That's a lot of points that and some that I hope we can come back to around what financial systems can do, how ESG responsibilities may be evolving in this space. So some really interesting opportunities, but very big challenges. And as if we don't have enough big issues on the table, I'm going to add a few more. Turning next to Emil Kakkis, who's CEO, President, and Director of Ultragenyx. Emil has a distinguished career in bringing treatments for rare diseases to patients, previously as Chief Medical Officer at Biomedical, now as founder and CEO of Ultragenyx, which has 3 approved therapies and a 4th ex-US therapy and a pipeline ahead in areas like gene therapies, mRNA therapies, and other types of treatments. Emil, you've been through a lot of this. Looking back over my career and way back years ago, there were real concerns about the lack of a pathway for biomedical progress in rare and ultra-rare diseases because of all the difficulties in undertaking a traditional clinical trial, finding enough patients, being able to hold that trial together effectively for long enough. And by measures of how many drugs are being approved in this space, we clearly have made some progress. Now, that's not to say there aren't a lot of unmet needs out there, but how are we doing, and what are the biggest challenges ahead in bringing these new innovative technologies forward in the rare disease space?
Well, thank you, Mark. I think we're doing very well from the standpoint there is a lot of new technologies that are working and that are bringing the potential for first-time treatments for many rare diseases. But there also is this growing challenge with expensive drugs and access to a wide variety of patients. So I want to make 3 points which help address that general point. First of all, I think we can pretty much align around that issue that if patients have a devastating disease and we have a treatment, they should be getting it. And in the US, Ultragenyx, we committed that we would get 100% coverage of patients, that the patient should not be treated because of a financial reason if they're an appropriate patient for treatment. And we committed to that by essentially filling in the gaps in the healthcare system. We provide fast start treatment, free treatment for patients while their insurance process may be ongoing. We will give them bridge if they change insurance, have issues. And if for whatever reason there's no insurance, no coverage, whatever happens, we give them free drug as well. And the idea is that we shouldn't let that happen. And the way we price the drug and the way we do this allows us to kind of fill in the gaps and to make sure it's happening. Now, outside the US, obviously that's a harder lift to do, but we do commit to majority access because I think the point Jay made is very true. I think it's tragic to have a great new rare disease drug and have 10% of the people on the drug. To me, that's a fail in our industry. We need to fix it, and we need to figure out how to do it. So we're working on that issue, and we are committed to an alignment around that. The thing that's most tricky about the whole pricing story is there is a difference between innovator companies developing a first ever treatment that's complex and sophisticated and companies that are selling something that's already been really generic and off patent, and we ought to make sure our system is addressing those issues separately because there's a whole set of different things. The other thing though about the pricing of a new innovator drug is there's something in there that's being priced. It's not like just buying an iPod or buying a hammer from the government. You're pricing not only the innovation of it, but you're buying a step in medical evolution. That is the first step. So when you talk about Aduhelm and Alzheimer's, you're taking a first step forward. Think about HIV drugs, first step. You could complain all day long about whether the first HIV drug was a good enough drug for HIV. Was it worth this? Would I pay for that? But you don't get to the second drug, the third drug, the combination highly active retroviral therapy. You don't get there if you don't pay for the first innovation step. And if you want an example of what happens when you don't, look at what happened to Achaogen, a company developing antibiotic. They had a first new antibiotic, it was very powerful, a new mechanism, we all wanted it. And then the FDA labeling was tough, and the reimbursers made it hard, and they're out of business. They're out of business, and they had a great drug, it worked very well. That's what you can do if you mess up. Medical evolution is part of what we're buying, and we want to make sure we're protecting that. When people are abusing the system in other ways, then let's make that distinctive and deal with it separately. The third thing, when you talk about price of drugs, you have to, and access, you have to understand the cost of development. And in the rare disease space, we're constantly struggling to manage the cost of development. And I think that was part of where your question was going. The truth is that for many of these genetic diseases, we should be able to use biomarkers that would help us shorten and speed the time. These are biomarkers that are what I call primary disease activity biomarkers. That is, they're the source of the disease, the underlying problem. And if you are using biomarkers that are right at the source, you're treating the underlying cause, now you're talking about a situation where you should be able to qualify that and get it through. If you get those drugs through, and we've published a paper on this, reduce the cost of investment for approval, 70%. When you do that, then you can put pressure on the pricing because it'll be okay. The system will be able to handle it if the cost of development is reduced. So when we think about pricing, we also have to think of the effect of pricing on the whole ecosystem of drug development and how that can affect things. So those are my 3 points. I think we commit to the need for access. It must happen. We must figure it out, and we'll fill the gaps in the way the system exists. But we need the policy changes on the big pieces regarding approval of new drugs, and as well as how do we deal with the other drugs that may be, or situations that we would all agree are not correct, and how we manage.
Well, thanks for laying that out, and it does seem like there's definitely a common appreciation of the significance of the problem, along with the opportunities of innovation, and maybe even some of the directions forward, which I'll hopefully come back to. One more piece of this very special innovation ecosystem that we're living in now is the potential for advanced diagnostics. So one of the big arcs in medical product development and disease understanding generally has been towards the ability to intervene earlier. Now, it's impossible to intervene earlier if you can't diagnose patients earlier. That's maybe relatively easy for some rare disease, single gene defects. It's a little bit more complicated for cancers, many of which go undetected until very late in their development. And it's also a challenge for some of these big disease opportunities that several of you mentioned, including neurodegenerative diseases, cardiovascular, cardiometabolic diseases that are made up of a lot of different influences, suggesting that not every patient is going to respond the same to every treatment. So to get at these issues of early diagnosis and targeting therapies effectively. AmirAli, I think you're a great person to have on this panel. AmirAli Talasaz is this co-founder and CEO of Guardant Health, which is a genomics, advanced diagnostics company. AmirAli, you've been at this kind of your whole career, previously at Illumina and elsewhere. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about what's ahead for, I know your work is mainly in cancer diagnostics, but maybe cancer diagnostics is an illustration of where healthcare could be headed and how diagnostics might help increase the opportunities, maybe create some additional challenges in making innovation accessible to all. Please let us know your thoughts.
Thank you, Mark. So excited to be part of this panel. Definitely there are some mega trends in our industry that we are very excited about, and we believe actually the future could be much brighter in terms of the health equity. When you think about that, some of the mega trends in bringing care and health services in a remote setting where the patients are residing versus bringing the patients to the facilities where expertise is, where all the infrastructure is, which has generated a lot of access issues so far. Maybe I give you an example of what we do at Guardant Health, which is around precision oncology, ranging from treatment selection in advanced cancer, looking at early sign of relapse. And we are very excited because today we launched our cancer screening product to detect early signs of colon cancer with just a simple blood test. Maybe I share some insights about that. Just look at United States. The compliance to colorectal cancer screening in the United States, after a lot of efforts, is kind of at around 66-67% for colonoscopy, for stool-based tests. And when you look at actually underserved patient population, like Latinos, that compliance rate drops to 50s. When you look at Black African American, the compliance is low 60s. And there is a lot of compliance issue in those underserved patient population, mainly because of the access to the healthcare and the patient preference for doing those colonoscopies or bulky stool tests. And a mega trend in bringing some of these diagnostics and screening tests to where patient is, for instance, this blood test. You can go wherever the patient is, in the community events, in churches, and effectively bring your screening technology and early detection to where they're residing. We are very excited about this mega trend, and we believe this can increase the compliance rate to cancer screening tremendously. Why it matters? Then late stage diagnosis and all the care and pain associated with it is going to get downshifted to early stage and in a much better health equity environment. The second pillar there, which I'm also excited about, is some of the movement in modernizing legislation and policies. Because we develop advanced diagnostics, but at the end, patients need to get access to it. Maybe I just do a quick poll. How many of you guys know what USPSTF is? Okay, just maybe a quarter of a room. So, in fact, we are talking about early detection and soon like preventative kind of measures, right? That's a voluntary task force in the United States, United States Preventive Services Task Force, which they are tasked to look at many kind of preventative measures for average risk patient, from cancer screening to some behavioral issues and preventive medication. After ACA, they have the authority now that if they put something in their guideline with high grading, all the commercial payers should give access to that test or medication to everybody, all the US citizens, with no out-of-pocket. Sounds awesome, right? But the issue is that organization is so underfunded that effectively they meet every 5 to 6 years. So once you have an innovative technology getting FDA approval, have the evidence till all of us get access to it, probably you have to wait 5 to 6 years. And we are seeing actually some movement there that, there are some potential modernization of some of the logistic work to make sure such an important task force get access to reasonable amount of funding. We are not talking about billions of dollars. We are talking about very few millions of dollars that kind of review of innovative technology can get reviewed much, much faster than today. I think the third element, which I'm excited about, some of the corporate commitments. We are hearing this health equity from many corporate stories now. And just one story from our side, since it's very close to our mission statement, is when you look at oncology drugs that got approved in 2020, the enrollment of African American in those clinical trials was at 8%. And where that's the beginning of some of the issues when the clinical trials are not representing underserved communities and population well. We did a 10,000 plus patient screening study and we committed to it. It was not easy, but at the end we enrolled 14% of those individuals. So it's possible. And definitely there are some kind of movement in terms of financial incentive to make sure some of the quality scores are right for providers and payers, to make sure there is some kind of a push to the ecosystem to make sure the health equity is going to get improved. Still a lot of work to do, but I see a much brighter future in terms of health equity in this country, at least.
Great. Well, thanks very much for your comments as well. And we've heard from almost everyone on the panel at this point, but I did want to save Andrea Ferris for last. Andrea has a unique perspective on innovation. She left a software company that she had helped found after her mother's death from cancer in 2008 with the goal of making a difference in the lives of patients and families affected by cancer. So you're living a lot of these issues in your day job around access to innovative treatments. Her commitment in this space has resulted in Longevity, which is the nation's largest lung cancer-focused nonprofit organization. It funds translational research into early detection and more effective treatments of of lung cancer. And Andrea, after hearing these different perspectives, what stands out for you? I mean, on the one hand, it does seem like we have a lot of innovative treatments coming, including but not limited to lung cancer diagnosis and treatment. On the other hand, some challenges where it seems like new steps are needed from the business community and the investment community. New policies might be needed around payment, and certainly new approaches to delivering care that's more upstream and early intervention oriented. So lots of there that you could comment on.
So that's a yes.
Yeah, what strikes you? Yeah.
Thanks, Mike. First, thank you for having me. As you said, lung cancer is a very large disease, but it is one, too, that has tremendously benefited from all these advancements in technology and new treatments. In fact, there have been more drugs approved in the past 5 years than in the prior 50 years combined. Lung cancer is at the forefront of precision medicine. It's at the forefront of immunotherapy, combination trials. So it's really pushing the envelope on a lot of these things. And it's a disease. When my mother passed away in 2008, she had the choice of chemotherapy and one clinical trial. Now it's a completely different scenario where we have long-term survivors. It's not 6 weeks diagnosis to death anymore. So it's a whole new host of issues that are faced with the community. But we were talking about access issues, and I think it comes at a variety of levels. So lung cancer, it's pushing the boundaries of regulatory reform. It pushes the boundaries of payment reform. But it also, one of the things that we haven't really talked about yet is healthcare delivery. Because how can a provider in a community setting who treats all types of cancers stay abreast of all of these changes that are happening? A lot of the technologies are very complex, and it does require specialization. How can we make that specialty more accessible to more people? We were talking about some policy-related issues. We heard at the beginning about telemedicine, telehealth, bringing it into the home. But what about practicing medicine across state lines so that people can access that specialist? Because as the diseases get more and more refined and more technical, there will be fewer people who are expert at it, but the people who are treating those who are diagnosed need access to that. So that's one aspect of it. The presenter at the beginning in the video also talked about patient-centric care. It sounds great, and believe me, I'm a believer in it. But how do we create a code so that a doctor has more than 5 minutes to spend with a patient to talk about that? How does a doctor or a provider actually explain the complexities of the disease so you can have those value-based conversations and shared decision-making? So I think that there are a lot of additional nuances beyond just the continued advancement in the science, which is awesome and phenomenal, and absolutely we need to continue investing in it. And look, any disease, it will benefit all those others that are coming down that path. But I think there are a number of other complexities, too, that go with it. Clinical trial redesign, reform, looking at endpoints, moving things earlier stage disease. So yes, there's a lot to unpack.
Yeah, lots to unpack. You all did a great set of comments laying out not only the opportunities and challenges in these areas, but paths forward. So there are a lot of things we could talk about. I definitely would like to hear any questions or topics that you all would like to follow up on. So remember, you can do that through the conference app. Just submit a question electronically, and it'll come up to me. I've heard a few things already, and maybe we could just start out with Andrea, your comment about how our healthcare systems aren't necessarily set up for doing early intervention, personalized care. We have a lot of support for those downstream complications, but primary care providers with only a few minutes of time and not much resources available to help make sure they look it up well. Those are challenges. I'll try to channel Meena Seshamani from the opening comments. One of the top priorities at CMS started in previous administration, so this is not a partisan issue, is to try to move the way that they support the delivery of care away from fee-for-service and towards paying for better coordinated care for people, so that the primary care docs don't have to focus just on going from short visit to short visit, and the specialists they're working with don't have to focus just on the downstream procedures, but can partner to provide expertise, and so that things like AI systems, good data and analytics can be paid for, and they're not really very well reimbursed traditionally. is that the right direction? Is that going to get us there? Any of you all have comments about what's needed in healthcare delivery to make it more amenable to these early interventions and transformative therapies?
Well, one thing I would put forth, Mark, is because the idea with rare diseases is the ability to get genomic sequencing if you have an unusual disorder. None of the plans are paying for it. So when a kid has developmental delay and seizures and they're 6 months old, they should be able to get that sequencing done, because there's almost no other way to make the diagnosis correctly. And if you make the diagnosis and you find out they have a disease that has a diet treatment or other type of treatment, they can implement a good plan. And right now the system doesn't do that. So all that we need is a very simple thing. Maybe it needs to be in PDUFA. Which number are we on? 8? PDUFA 8?
Getting up there, yeah. 7, I think.
We should be getting coverage for that. Maybe that affects what you've been talking about as well. I don't think we want a 5-year task force for it. We already know you need to do it.
Yeah. I think there are some kind of simple solutions there are some short wins that we can have, quick wins that we could have to really make some very good impact. Like I gave it a USPSTF as an example, but about this health delivery. And like, for instance, just imagine if for each COVID test that you wanted to do, instead of just waiting in line, you had to make an appointment with your primary care physician first. He orders or she ordered something, and then you go and stand in a line, right? Versus a bunch of changes that happen in the background of regulation of there. You could go and just get the COVID test done, and a bunch of physician ordering in the early days were happening in the background. So now bring that, for instance, in renovating the way we can manage cancer. So, and PCPs do not have time. They are just spending 5 minutes. How come we cannot maybe modernize the way healthcare is getting practiced? And there are some kind of trends by, Minute Clinic or, Amazon Care, and bringing actually PCPs effectively to the living room. But how come we can't have a healthcare system that you want to get cancer screening, you can get your disease, you can get the screening, and then if there are some kind of findings, then you go back to the health system and figure out what's wrong. That would really open a bunch of capacity from healthcare givers. I think there are some learnings from COVID that we have to figure out how could we scale it in general across bunch of diagnostics and care services that we are offering.
Yeah, AmirAli, I got a comment on this topic too. Maybe we could follow up on as well. You talked about in COVID, we didn't do the usual approach that I think you mentioned, Jay, leads to maybe set a price up here that's expected to cover costs and so forth, maybe reaches 10% of eligible patients in high-income countries, 1% in low-income countries. COVID we did it a different way. We sort of calculated how many people are there that need to be treated, what's the affected population, how do we put contracts in place to get that quantity of whether it's tests or therapies or vaccines, and then how can we deal with these delivery system challenges like we've already talked about. Is there openness among product developers to a different kind of payment model that might be more population oriented like that? I mean, it seems like high prices, 1%, 10% treated doesn't quite get there from either a public health and access standpoint, or maybe even from sort of optimizing revenue. You're going to have a lot more value add if it's a larger population treated.
Yeah, I think really the difference with the COVID pandemic was you had an outcome in mind. It was clear what you needed to achieve, and then everything was set in motion to get there. And typically what we have is not an outcomes-focused healthcare system, right? It's a lot about cost containment, etc. So I think there's a real opportunity to do it differently. And we are already, between the pharmaceutical industry and payers, piloting a lot of things. I mean, for example, for very expensive gene therapies such as Zolgensma, Novartis put in place this annuity model where there's a certain payment every year, and there's not the bulk of cost that falls in one.
And actually potentially linked to the outcomes that the patients were getting too.
Also, I think the UK government is really putting very interesting contracts in place to treat large populations for cholesterol management. So I think there's a lot of pilots ongoing. We have invested in a company that is doing also something really interesting. So they enter into contracts with big companies, and they say, we will manage for you a certain population of patients. For example, we will manage your, could be lung cancer or whatever type of patients, and you only pay for outcomes. And we are going to put systems in place where, every employee that is eligible can have, 24/7 access to telehealth. We negotiate contracts to have the best possible or the best prices for drugs. And then everything that we gain into the efficiency of care and the lower cost as a result of it, that is actually what the company takes out as their profit. So these are totally different models, thinking about, again, what is the outcome that you want to achieve? And the outcome is really that the patient needs to be at the center of everything. And I also do believe that with all the advancement in technology now, I think technology will really bring, this possibility of putting the patient at the center.
Of tracking the outcomes, tracking the patients, supporting the primary care doctors. That gets back to Mina's comments at the very beginning. Does this seem like something that could work from a product developer standpoint, diagnostics, therapeutics?
I think it could. I think we talk about the problem that companies have to set a price and then negotiate access, and that leads to a decision many companies to price higher, not knowing what's going to happen down the road. And we've talked a lot about the benefit of negotiating price and access together, which is really where the revenue will come for a company. And some people have called this in certain countries the Netflix model, where the company agrees to pay all the people with this disease in the entire country for a set price, a set amount. And to the extent that it brings the cost per patient down, I think it's a tremendous benefit, more people getting access. The fact the price goes down is compensated by the fact that the total revenue being provided is actually improved compared to what they might have gotten had they launched with a high price and limited access. So I think those types of models are going in the right direction, and we just have to fix the system now, which starts a certain way with a certain chess game being played that's leaving patients out in the cold sometimes.
Mark, can I just comment on that? So one of the other things that's not been discussed with payment design and all of that too is the cost of the patient, because their out-of-pocket costs go up, up, up. It never comes down, even when the cost is being taken out or they have these innovative payment models and everything. It doesn't filter down, and the issue of financial toxicity is very real, and that's what, at the end of the day, is going to impede access.
Yeah, if this doesn't really get to accountability for the patients actually getting the treatment, and that means affordability.
It doesn't flow down.
Yeah, it's a great point. And Jay, I'd like your perspective on.
I think there's a spectrum, right, of areas where the payment model and reimbursement models are evolving differently. So I don't think we've solved it yet in terms of payment models for gene therapies and more advanced treatments. I think there are many initiatives looking at access to cancer care right now, trying to make sure that there are different types of reimbursement models in place. On the other end of the spectrum, you also have subscription-based models for antibiotics, very similar to the Netflix model that you see, where countries are starting to say, we want to pay for the right to have a arsenal of antibiotics available, rather than paying per product, per volume, because that leads to overselling and actually leads to more problems than good, because your product becomes ineffective after a number of years due to drug resistance. So there's a spectrum of different models that are there. The big problem is scale, as Marianne pointed out, that a lot of these are limited as pilots, and you need that level of global solidarity to create enough critical mass for the subscription-based model, or to create enough critical mass to make sure that multiple beneficiaries, right down to the patients, are able to benefit from a model that works for gene therapies. And some countries are working on that. So Novartis, for example, works with the Chinese government and multiple manufacturers to see, can you reduce the price of the price of making the drug, and also the service involved in administering Zolgensma to patients itself in China, and can that be a gateway to more Southeast Asian countries and more emerging markets? In rare diseases, there's been a lot of innovation in looking at building registries so that you find the patients early. That helps innovation, that helps also recruitment when it comes to clinical studies, but also be able to be more committed in terms of the activities around patient assistance programs and named patient programs when it comes to rare diseases. And Shire and Biogen, before they got acquired, was working in South Africa and Brazil, initially as part of the CSR programs, but eventually that did lead to a significant amount of business. So I think you need that daring from a company's perspective, that strong commitment, so that these gentlemen on the left of me, don't basically just say,
right.
yeah, it's true, and the lady all the way on the right, and the companies that they represent, keep that vision alive to say, I'm going to challenge myself to make sure that I'm reaching as many partnerships as possible to expand access as much as I can, redesigning the way they make the products, so the products are also as simple as to administer as possible, as de-risked as possible. Make sure that the clinical studies are not skewed towards one or two populations, and try to incentivize their staff to make sure that that's actually in place. And yes, the spectrum is obviously very wide. In new therapies, there are limited opportunities, and I think a lot of governments are struggling with that right now. But you do see that, back down to the point on individual patients, there are a lot of innovations out there in terms of reducing out-of-pocket costs. Again, scale is an issue, but mobile wallets have been instrumental in areas around Kenya and Nigeria in improving out-of-pocket payments and reducing out-of-pocket payments for patients, so that they can access a multitude of care products.
Yeah, so lots of innovations there.
Pilots.
But all at the pilot stage, as you said, and it does seem like this different approach to payment that you all have described would take out the conflict that inherently happens now between manufacturers wanting a high price per unit and payers not necessarily wanting to pay all of that. It's really all about alignment around how do we get the best outcomes for the population, and how do we co-create these approaches. But this daring and bold change is not something you often hear associated with big global companies. Is this something that we can make happen? What would accelerate the process? Do you need something more from the from governments? Is it something that private sector leadership can address?
So maybe I give you some successful examples, in United States. Like there are some companies like Japan, like our treatment selection product, we get Japanese approval, like the PMDA approval, and a few quarters after we get national coverage. But I don't want to go into the pros and cons of universal healthcare. There are a lot of good things to like about the payment system and the healthcare that we have in the U.S. A good example of what's working nice, even in this complicated payment system, again, for colon cancer screening. We know it saves lives, it's good for patients. The incentives of patients, providers, health systems, and payers are all aligned. How? There are quality scores defined on the compliance rate to colon cancer, and commercial payers have financial incentive to make sure those quality scores are higher, because they get higher payment for Medicare Advantage patient population that they are covering. So there's laser focus to increase compliance rate for colon cancer screening. Now, bring this to lung cancer. That quality matrix is not there. I have a news to share. Just 5% of eligible people in the United States are getting screened for lung cancer. Just those incentives are not there. Although we know we can save a lot of lives by lung cancer screening. We're building blood cancers to kind of bring the innovative diagnostic again to patients, but those financial incentives are not completely aligned. Is it a high bar to make that happen? No, but it needs a cross-functional activities between patient advocacy groups, quality teams, CMS, and Medicare Advantage planning for commercial payers to make sure that everybody is driving for the same benefit at the end of the day. And that financial incentive, I think, would really drive behaviors.
All right, this ended up being a very broad panel, given the scope of issues that we were asked to deal with and the great and diverse perspectives on innovations that you all bring. We're down to our last couple of minutes. Miriam, maybe I could go to you for the last comment, and then I'm going to end with Andrea. But do you share the same optimism that these steps can be overcome, these obstacles can be overcome from a...
Yeah, I mean, we very strongly believe in the power of partnerships. And even though it's anecdotal and pilots, I mean, we're all trying to somehow make it work. I mean, for example, we entered into a collaboration to see, how can we get more, equitable recruitment in clinical trials, and we worked together with Stanford Medicine and HUMA, and we set up a cardiovascular trial where there was never, a direct interaction with a patient. Patients were recruited via social media. We recruited 100 patients in 2 weeks. They received, all information via televisits. They received devices at home to measure blood pressure and EKGs. They, entered into 4 televisits during the trial. They, they monitored their adherence.
Can be done.
Everything. I mean, it was amazing to see how that was possible. And we were really, really surprised. So even though these are all just, us trying, I think eventually, as we get more experience with it, we will be able to scale this, right? And I'm so really optimistic that this and a lot of other examples of how we, across industry and academia and tech companies all together can find these solutions.
And Andrea, for the last word on this, Jay talked about how this is becoming more of a topic in board meetings. It's part of the ESG discussion development now, thanks to your efforts. It's on the minds of not just company leaders, but financial institutions and corporate leaders. What else could, any final words on making more progress here?
Continue to invest in innovation, but it will take a systems level approach with multi-stakeholders to actually ensure access to patients.
Great. And a good word to end on. I want to thank our panel for covering an incredibly broad array of topics and bringing together some key themes. These are hard problems to solve around access and equity, not just here in the United States, but globally. But it's great to hear about the opportunities and the potential support for some big changes here that could really get to alignment and better population outcomes and equity. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.